Wyoming Territory, August 1879. The girl had a sack over her head when they sold her. The sun beat down hard on the Laramie stockyards, dust rising off the trampled ground like smoke after a fire. She was tied by the wrists, rope biting into skin rubbed raw. Someone had stuffed a dirty burlap sack over her face. She could not see the men trading money for her. Could not see the glances, the spit, the laughter. Her dress was torn and muddy. Her boots had been taken. She stood barefoot in the dirt, trembling. Sold $30, the man barked. She heard the jingle of coins, the creak of a saddle, the low grumble of a horse, then quiet footsteps, slower, not rough like the others. A man's voice, low and steady, cut through the noise. "Take it off and look at me." No one moved. The voice came again, firmer this time. "You heard me." Take the sack off her head. A sharp tug and the world poured in. Light, dust, color. She blinked hard, squinting against the brightness, and stared up into the face of a stranger. He had sharp cheekbones, sun-browned skin, and eyes the color of burnt amber. A trail of sweat rolled down from under his hat. He looked younger than the others, no more than 30, but there was weight behind his gaze. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. "What's your name?" he asked. "I." Her throat burned. She swallowed hard. "Rhetta Oakes," she added after a beat, voice hoarse. The man held her eyes. "I'm Zeke Langston." He reached up slowly, untied the rope at her wrists. Her arms dropped like dead weight. "You're safe now," he said, voice quiet. "I ain't like them." Behind them, the seller grunted. "She's sold, Cowboy. Ain't no refunds." Zeke dug into his coat, pulled out more coins. Dropped them in the man's hand without looking. "Then she's mine. That makes it my business what happens next." He turned back to Rhetta. "Can you walk?" "I think so," she whispered. He didn't wait. He helped her up behind him on the buckskin gelding, careful, gentle. She clung to his shirt without thinking. Her fingers dug into the fabric, and he didn't flinch. They rode out fast, past the stock pens, past the jeering men. He didn't say anything more until they were 2 miles east, the town a blur behind them. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. Zeke pulled off at a small creek lined with cottonwoods. He helped her down, handed her a blanket from his saddlebag, then dug out some dry biscuits and jerky. He poured water from his canteen into her cupped hands. She ate slowly, watching him. "You got family?" he asked. Rhetta shook her head. "None that would claim me." He didn't press. Just nodded like he understood. They sat there a while, the afternoon breeze rustling the trees. Zeke kept his hat tipped low, eyes scanning the horizon. Finally, she asked, "Why'd you buy me?" He looked at her, steady. "Because no one else was going to stop it." Her breath caught. She looked down at the blanket in her lap. "You gonna take me somewhere?" "I'll take you where you want to go." "I do not know where that is." Zeke's eyes softened. "Then stay with me until you figure it out." He stood, offered his hand. She took it. They rode east along the river. He never reached for her. Never touched her unless she needed help down or up or steadying in the saddle, but he always looked at her like she mattered. That night, they made camp near a ridge where the pines grew thick and the air was cool. He gave her the blanket, took the harder ground. "You can sleep safe," he said. "No one's gonna hurt you now." She lay awake a long time, staring up at the stars. By the third day, Rhetta spoke more. She asked about his horse, his land, where he came from. "South Texas," he said. "Lost my folks to fever when I was 16. Been on the trail since." "You always rescue girls with sacks on their heads?" she asked, a tiny smile tugging at her lips. He chuckled. First time, by the 5th day, they reached his homestead. It was small, just a log cabin and a barn nestled in a green valley with pine-sloped hills all around. A few chickens pecked near the fence. The place looked quiet, lived in. "You built this?" she asked. "With my own hands," he said. "Took me a year." She stood there, unsure. "You do not owe me anything," he said, reading her face. "I know," she said softly, "but I want to help." And she did. She swept the cabin, cooked what she could, learned the rhythm of the place. Zeke never asked more than she could give. He worked the land, chopped wood, fixed the roof. But when he came back in the evenings, he always looked for her first. Sometimes they sat on the porch in silence, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Sometimes she told him pieces of her story, how her parents died in a fire, how the uncle who took her in sold her when money got tight. How she stopped believing anyone would ever come for her. Zeke never pitied her. He just listened. One evening, 2 weeks in, she brought him a biscuit and coffee. He took it, warm fingers brushing hers. "You're stronger than you think," he said. She looked at him, heart thudding. "I feel stronger here." He set the cup down slowly. "You don't have to leave, Rhetta, not unless you want to." "I do not want to," she whispered. Zeke stepped closer. He reached for her hand, held it gently, like she was something he had waited a long time to find. "If you stay," he said, "it'll be as your own woman, not because I bought you, not because I saved you, because you choose it." Tears welled in her eyes. "I choose it," she breathed, and when he kissed her it was careful, tender, like a promise. She clung to him, not from fear but from something new, something that felt like coming home. The first frost came early that year. By the time the aspens had dropped their last yellow leaves, Rhetta had learned how to split kindling without bruising her palms and how to tell when the cornbread was done just by scent. She was still quiet most mornings, her thoughts tucked behind her eyes like folded linen, but her footsteps no longer hesitated when she crossed the porch. She had begun to hum sometimes while she worked, soft and tuneless, as if her voice was remembering how not to be afraid. Zeke stayed out longer with the cattle as the grass thinned, riding the northern slope where the pine shadows stretched long across the snow-dusted ground. One evening, he came in with a gash down his forearm, shirt sleeve torn and dried blood crusted at the seam. "Barbed wire," he muttered, setting his rifle by the door. Fence gave out near the northern line. Rhetta took the kettle off the fire without a word, poured hot water into the basin and brought out the tin of carbolic. She didn't flinch at the sight of the wound. Her hands were steady as she wiped the dirt away. "You need to mend that fence before the elk get in," she said, voice even. "I will. After this heals up. You'll be too late." Zeke said nothing for a moment, then gave a short nod. "I'll take the south ridge first thing tomorrow." "Bring new wire." She finished cleaning the cut, then wrapped it in muslin she'd boiled earlier that day. Her fingers brushed his wrist as she tied it off. "You shouldn't ride alone with your arm like this," she said. Zeke lifted his gaze. "I've done worse. You shouldn't have had to." Zeke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You offering to come, I'm offering not to let you bleed out on a frozen trail." They left at dawn, the horse's breath hanging in the cold like smoke. Rhetta rode the smaller mule, Bonnie, who favored her left hind leg but still moved steady over rough ground. Zeke didn't offer advice. He just watched her ride, quiet approval in the angle of his jaw. When they reached the ridge, she dismounted without waiting for help and began uncoiling the wire from the pack mule. Zeke joined her, kneeling to hammer in the first stake with his good arm. "You ever fix fence before?" he asked. "No, but I've watched. Watching's half of learning. Doing's the rest." They worked in rhythm, her holding the posts while he nailed them in, then stretching the wire taut between the stakes. Snowmelt soaked through the knees of her skirt, but she didn't complain. When her fingers fumbled once, Zeke reached out and steadied them, his hand warm through her glove. "You learn fast," he said. "I had to." They paused at midday to eat cold fribread and apples. Zeke leaned against a fallen pine, his wounded arm resting on his knee. Rhetta sat across from him on a stump, watching a hawk circle overhead. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" he asked after a while. I used to dream of trains and far cities. And now, I think peace don't come from where you are. It comes from who you're with." Zeke looked at her for a long time. "You believe that now? I believe it here." Neither of them said more. The hawk disappeared beyond the ridge and Rhetta stood to gather the tools. They returned to the homestead as dusk settled in, the last of the light gold behind the mountains. In the barn, she rubbed down the mule while Zeke pitched hay. The quiet between them wasn't heavy, it felt settled, like something understood without needing words. After supper, she lit the oil lamp and sat at the small writing desk by the window, the one he'd made from pine boards and square nails. She pulled out a scrap of paper and a blunt pencil. Zeke watched from the hearth, where he was stitching a tear in his coat. "What are you writing?" she hesitated. "A list." "Of what?" She turned slightly in her chair. "Things I want to learn." He waited. "How to bake without burning the bottom, how to ride at a gallop, how to shoot straight, how to plant squash so it don't rot." He smiled, slow and soft. "That's a fine list." She stood, walked over and knelt beside him. "You'll teach me." "I will." Their eyes met, and something in her chest eased like a knot pulling loose. "I want to stay," she said quietly, "not just for now." "For good." Zeke reached out, tucked a curl behind her ear, the backs of his fingers grazing her cheek. "Then you'll stay," he said. She leaned into his touch, and he kissed her again, deeper this time, but still careful. She didn't tremble. She didn't pull away. And when they stood and went to the bed they now shared, it was not out of need or rescue, but choice. Each step, each breath made with trust. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing snow from the pine boughs. Inside, the fire burned low, and two hearts beat steady in the quiet. By late November, the ground had hardened under a crust of snow, and the creek near the edge of the property ran slower, its edges rimmed with ice. Rhetta had begun rising before first light, lighting the stove by feel, her breath fogging in the chill air of the cabin. The mornings were hers now, quiet moments of warmth and rhythm before Zeke returned from the barn, his boots heavy with frost. They'd settled into a way of being that didn't need naming. Zeke taught her how to read the weather in the shape of clouds, how to tell if a deer had passed by the freshness of its tracks. She found herself watching the world more closely, not out of fear anymore, but because it had become hers to notice. One morning she stood at the window, holding a cup of chicory, watching a coyote move along the tree line. Zeke came in, brushing snow from his collar. "Found something in the shed," he said, setting a small wooden box on the table. Rhetta turned, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Old tools," he went on. "From the man who had this place before me. Most of it's rusted through, but there's a hand plane still good. You ever done woodwork?" She shook her head. "I used to watch my father whittle. He made me a bird once. Painted it blue with crushed berries." Zeke opened the box, revealing the plane and a few dull blades. "You could learn. Be good to fix the drawer in the washstand." Rhetta touched the edge of the plane, her fingers brushing the worn handle. "I'd like that." He stepped back, letting her lift it herself. She felt the weight of it settle in her palms, solid, useful. Late that afternoon, they moved a workbench onto the porch. Zeke showed her how to sharpen the blades on a whetstone, how to test the edge against her thumb without drawing blood. She took to it with the same quiet focus she gave everything now, measured, patient. When she made her first clean cut, she glanced up, eyes bright with something unspoken. He handed her a scrap of pine. "That's yours, practice on it." She sat cross-legged on the porch, sleeves rolled, curls tucked back with a strip of muslin. Zeke leaned against the railing, arms folded, watching her work. "You ever think about building something new?" she asked, not looking up. "I've thought on it." What would it be, he considered? Maybe a second stall in the barn or a bigger table. Rhetta looked up at that. "Why a bigger table?" He met her eyes, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Because someday, maybe it won't just be us." She held his gaze, the cold air forgotten between them. That night, she didn't light the lamp after supper. They sat by the fire, the only sound the pop of pitch in the logs. She reached for his hand, fingers threading through his without hesitation. "I want to grow roots here," she said. "You already have." "No," she said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "Now I want to plant them on purpose." Zeke kissed her temple, slow and sure. "Then we'll build whatever you need." They didn't speak of the past anymore. Not out of silence, but because it no longer held sway. The rhythm of their days had replaced it, a rhythm shaped by shared labor, shared breath, and something gentler than either of them had known before. The next morning, Rhetta began measuring the broken drawer. She did it with the same care she'd once used to measure her steps in unfamiliar rooms. Zeke watched her from the doorway, arms crossed. "You're different than when I found you," he said. She didn't pause in her work. "You didn't find me. You saw me." He stepped down from the threshold, crossed to where she stood, and set his hand lightly on her back. "That's what love is," he said. Seeing, she turned to him, her face open and unguarded. "Then I love you," she said. Zeke's eyes softened, and he cupped her face with both hands. "I've loved you since the first time you said your name." They stood there as the snow began to fall again, light, steady, covering the ground like a beginning. The wind shifted from north to west by mid-December, carrying the scent of pine sap and something distant, like wood smoke from another valley. Rhetta stood at the edge of the pasture, her apron dusted with sifted flour, watching Zeke mend the sled runner where it had cracked along the grain. She had been baking since sunrise, working butter into flour until her hands ached, but now the light was gold and low, and the rhythm of the day had slowed. Zeke straightened, rubbing his jaw with the back of his wrist. "Sled'll hold for a few more hauls, but I'll need new ash planks come spring." "I could help you fell the tree," Rhetta offered, brushing her fingers clean on her skirt. He glanced at her, not surprised. "You ever swung an axe?" "No." "But I've watched you." Zeke let out a quiet breath through his nose, half a laugh. "That answer's starting to sound familiar." "I learn fast," she said, stepping toward him. "You said so once." He looked at her then, not with amusement, but with something steadier. "You've got grit." "That's different from learning." She tilted her head. "You think I don't know the difference?" "I think most folks wouldn't stay long enough to find out." The barn door creaked open behind them, and a white hen darted out with a scolded squawk. Rhetta turned toward the sound, but Zeke kept his eyes on her. "I've been thinking," he said. She met his gaze. "About what?" He wiped his hands on a rag. "There's a church being built 4 miles south, little white clapboard thing. Preacher rides in every third Sunday. You want to go?" she asked, cautious. "I want to take you," he said. "Proper." Rhetta's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the way he said it, like it had settled in him long before the words had formed. "I don't need a preacher's words to know what I am with you," she said. "I know, but I want it done clean. For you, for us." She stepped to him then, laying her hand over his heart. "Then we'll go." The next Sunday, she wore a dress she'd sewn from bolt cloth Zeke had ordered early, that autumn linen dyed plum, with a hem she'd stitched twice to get even. He tied his cravat for the first time in 6 months, fumbling with the knot until Rhetta batted his hands away and did it herself, her fingers quick and sure. They rode the sled across the packed snow, Zeke guiding the team with one hand and keeping the other curled loosely around hers beneath the buffalo robe. The church was no more than a single room with a stove in the corner and pine benches still smelling of sap. A few other families had gathered, faces ruddy with cold, eyes curious. The preacher was gray-bearded and stooped, but his voice was clear when they stood before him. He asked the questions plainly. Zeke answered without hesitation. When it was Rhetta's turn, her voice didn't waver. Afterward, a woman with a red shawl pressed a jar of preserves into Rhetta's hands. "First jar's always strawberry," she said. "It's tradition." Rhetta blinked, then smiled. "Thank you." Zeke helped her into the sled, his glove brushing her waist, and they rode home through falling snow. The land around them was quiet, deer tracks crossing the white fields, smoke rising from distant chimneys. No words passed between them on the ride, but none were needed. That night they shared supper by firelight, salt pork and beans with fresh cornbread. Rhetta pulled the quilt over their shoulders as the wind moaned low around the eaves. Her head rested against Zeke's chest, his breath steady against her hair. "You ever think on what comes next?" she asked. He looked into the fire. "I think of spring, of the orchard needing pruning. Of trading for seed potatoes." She smiled against him. "I meant further on." Zeke shifted, just enough to see her. "I think of growing old with you, of building onto the cabin when we need more space. Of teaching a boy how to saddle his first horse or a girl how to hold a hammer straight." Rhetta's throat tightened. She reached for his hand beneath the quilt, lacing their fingers. "Then we'll plan for more lumber," she whispered. Zeke kissed her knuckles, slow and sure. "We'll build it all together." Snow fell outside, soft as breath. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, and in the quiet warmth of that room, their future stretched out, not fragile, not uncertain, but real. Wooden walls. Earth beneath their feet, hands that chose each other again and again. By late March, the river broke open with the thaw. Chunks of ice drifted along the current, slow and heavy, pushing against each other like cattle in a chute. The valley softened under the warming sun. Mud took the place of snow, and the first green blades of grass pushed up near the cabin's west wall, where the stones held the day's heat a little longer. Rhetta had begun keeping a journal. Not of the past, she didn't waste ink on memories that no longer held her, but of the present, and days that built forward. She wrote about which seeds sprouted first, how many eggs the hens had given, the way Zeke's voice deepened when he read aloud from the newspaper he fetched from town every fortnight. One evening, she was bent over the small table, candlelight flickering against the paper, when Zeke stepped through the door with a coat slung over one arm and a small wooden box in the other. He set it down beside her without a word. She looked up. "What is it?" "Something from Trenton," he said. "Ordered it back in January." She lifted the lid. Inside was a folded piece of blue muslin, finer than anything she'd ever owned, and beneath it, a hand-carved pin shaped like a willow branch, smoothed and polished to a soft sheen. Her breath caught. "You sent for this. I figured you ought to have something for Sundays that wasn't made by necessity." She ran her fingers over the cloth, then looked up at him. "You think of everything." "Not everything," he said, voice low. "But the things that matter." She rose slowly, the muslin still in her hand. "I never expected a life like this." He stepped closer. "You made it." As spring lengthened, they planted together. Rows of beans, squash, and barley went in under Rhetta's careful marking. Zeke dug a trench for irrigation from the creek, and she lined it with river stones. She stitched a new curtain for the east-facing window, where dawn now reached the floor by the time they rose. In the evenings, they sat close, not always speaking. Sometimes Zeke read from an old calendar almanac, sometimes Rhetta mended by lamp glow and let her thoughts wander. He'd begun building a cradle, though no words had passed between them on the subject. Not yet. But the wood was there, and her eyes lingered on it when she passed. One quiet day in April, Rhetta came in from the barn with her sleeves damp and a braid falling loose over her shoulder. Zeke was at the hearth, oiling the hinges of the chest by the bed. "You ever miss the trail?" she asked, shrugging out of her shawl. He didn't look up. "Used to." "Not anymore." "Why not?" Zeke sat back on his heels. "Because that life was always borrowed. This one's built." She walked to him, crouched beside the hearth. "I never built anything before this. You've built more than you know." He reached into the chest and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in flannel. Inside, a single-page deed creased from years of storage. "I never put your name on it," he said. "Not because I didn't want to. I just didn't know how long you'd choose to stay." She unfolded the paper slowly. "It's time you did. I'll take it into town next week, make it legal." She pressed her palm to the page. "It already is." May brought the sound of frogs in the creek and birds nesting near the rafters of the barn. Rhetta leaned heavier now when she walked, her steps slower, her hands often resting low on her belly. Zeke built a bench for her beside the cabin door where she could rest in the afternoons, the scent of lilacs drifting in from the slope. One evening, after supper, she folded the last of the baby shirts she'd sewn and placed them in the cradle. Her hand lingered on the edge, fingers tracing the grain. She turned to Zeke, who stood near the hearth, sharpening the drawknife. "I think I'll be a good mother," she said. He set the tool down. "You already are." The birth came in early July, under a sky pulsing with heat. Zeke rode for the midwife at first light, and she came with her daughter and a canvas bag heavy with boiled rags and willow bark tincture. Rhetta labored through the day, her jaw tight, the room filled with the low thrum of effort and breath. Zeke waited outside, pacing the length of the porch with fists clenched at his sides. When the cry came, sharp and strong, he stopped mid-step. The midwife opened the door, her face glistening. "You've got a daughter, and a wife who's stronger than most men I've known." He stepped inside, breath held. Rhetta lay back against the pillows, her hair damp, a small wrapped bundle nestled against her chest. She looked up, eyes rimmed with fatigue and something deeper, something steady as mountain stone. "Come meet her," she said. Zeke crossed the room slowly, sat beside her and looked down at the child. Her skin was red and wrinkled, her mouth pursed like she was already considering the world. "She's got your eyes," Rhetta said. He brushed a knuckle across the baby's downy cheek. "She's got your will." She laughed softly, then winced. "Don't make me laugh yet." He leaned down, kissed her forehead. "You did it." "We did," she whispered. That night, the three of them slept in the same room, the cradle pulled close to the bed. Zeke's hand found Rhetta's under the quilt, and they lay in the hush of the new world they'd made, the fire burning low. Years later, the bench by the door grayed with weather. A second cradle stood stored in the loft, and the orchard bore fruit. Zeke taught two strong-limbed children to braid rope and drive fence posts, and Rhetta kept a second journal with pages full of pressed flowers and notes of births, storms, and harvests. They grew older, silver at their temples, hands still calloused from work. But they never left the valley. Never needed more than what they'd built together: wood, earth, firelight, and love earned slow and held fast. And every evening, no matter the season, Zeke would reach for Rhetta's hand as the sun dipped low behind the pines and hold it like he had the first time, gently, with all his strength.